used to work in Canberra on a thing called the Muslim Community Reference Group, followed by the Imams Conference, and there were several staged meetings over a couple of years, and every night before a meeting occurred, Peter Costello used to come out and say something nasty about Muslims. And then the following weeks, we'd have people walking down the streets having things thrown at them, spat at, whatever. So that's the context. If we support people's right to be vile, how do we deal with that? Particularly when people in a leadership position are giving ordinary people permission to abuse people on the street.
Thank you. That's a very good and very important question. And I need to say something about it, but we're perhaps equally capable of thinking of alternatives. I was making the strong argument that, however ugly it is, there's a very high price to pay if we don't permit it. I mean, again, forgive me for quoting Chomsky, but he puts it very powerfully. He says, look, even Goebbels gave free speech to the views he agreed with. The point is to give free speech to the views that you detest. And that's what distinguishes a liberal society where that's the Socratic point, that we have to, as much as we hate certain views, and your point is the one, we have to understand the broader consequences of the kind of society we want if we suppress the detestable views. And I always say that Chomsky is going to be the first one to be suppressed. Now, to answer your question more directly, the obvious corollary of what I'm saying is that we have to find, and it's not like we can't imagine, all sorts of other ways to combat the vile racism. We, after all, have at our disposal all of the media and the op-eds, and it's not like we don't have any other resources. So it's not like there's no other alternative except to make them illegal. And it's not like we have no mechanisms, books and the articles, and there's enough people, the majority after all, who don't share those views. And I have to just add that I share the terrible concern about the extent of the Islamophobia, to use that word. Given my history, it's, I think, in some sense, in some ways, worse than the anti-Semitism that I grew up learning about and how bad that was, and of course it led to terrible things. But this is a global kind of contagion of the worst kind of racism, and we have to do something. I'm just suggesting that the law is not the way to deal with it.
Alice Beecham. I am determined to be an optimist, and I think BDS is proving highly successful. Otherwise, why would Israel be getting into such hysterics about it and about suppressing it? Now that I have the mic, I also want to say that the Holocaust, of which I was God knows a part, seems to be being used by Israel now as an excuse for doing whatever they like. Take the last example, most recent example, the women's boat to Gaza, where they actually took over a peaceful boat, trying to just get to Gaza to bring some hope, of internationally acclaimed women in international waters. A totally illegal act. But they are entitled, aren't they, to do whatever they like and persecute yet another people.
Alice, about the success of BDS, I don't disagree in many ways, but if you take the case of Australia, there's only one staff group on all the Australian universities who exist to support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. It's in Sydney, and when you think of the behaviour of the media, who fear to even to address the BDS issue, we'll no doubt elaborate that point later on. I mean, the mainstream media, the mainstream newspapers, the mainstream television, radio stations, scared stiff to comment about the BDS movement. So and so are the majority of politicians in Canberra, absolutely scared stiff to deal with it. So on the one hand, the divestment of major funds from Israeli commercial and manufacturing enterprise is encouraging, but in Australia, I don't think it's so encouraging.
I wanted to add one other word of optimism to add to yours, Alice. One of the things that we've discovered is, despite the enormous reluctance of some groups, including my own, APAN, the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, to embrace BDS because of the fear of the vilification, to some extent that fear has had its effect. One of the interesting insights was that after 1 year rejecting the proposal to adopt it, when we did, as APAN now has adopted it officially, we expected that firstly, as they worried, the doors would close to us when we lobby in Canberra and that membership would fall away and so on. What was most interesting was that the usual suspects who would resort to immediate denunciation and vilification, they were practically silent. So when you call their bluff on the anti-Semitic slur and the denunciation, when you publicly stand up and say this is bullshit and we're not going to tolerate it and assert BDS, we were surprised actually there was very little response. So that should give courage and strength to BDS to refute this absurd condemnation. Yeah.
I agree with Peter about supporting Brandeis. Senator Brandeis' stand on, I'm the only one who can insult me. There is, and I think that should apply to everybody. However, incitement to hate is a different issue. It's a far more complex issue. And a real question. Support was expressed for Richard Falk and the work that he was doing in trying to assess what happened in Gaza. At the same time, the speakers were critical of the press, telling half-truths about all sorts of issues. Now, Mr. Falk is well known for having a particular, very strong bias. How could he reasonably have been someone who could reasonably produce a fair analysis of what happened? And is it not intellectually dishonest to, in fact, propose that? As Stuart, I think, did.
Look, I disagree totally with what you've said. I think he's one of the most conscientious and reliable jurists in the Western world. I think he's a person of enormous integrity. You only have to go to Gaza, where 50% of it is rubble, to witness the cruelty that the West in many ways has colluded with. And Richard Falk, to his enormous credit, has had the courage to report on so that we have some idea of the cruelty that passes for policy that we've colluded with.
Why do you think that people who don't already have Falk could have produced an equally damning report? That's my point.
Well, because he was the person given that responsibility by the UN. So it's difficult enough to get into those parts of the world anyway. There are many other massacres where the UN is not even allowed to conduct an investigation. I was on that. So, he was the person, and his successor, I think, has just been appointed Secretary General.
Look, I don't want to get into the specifics of Richard Falk, although I agree entirely with Stuart that he's the most distinguished, respectable jurist in this. But every human rights organisation that has anything to say about this concurs with his judgments, including the Israeli B'Tselem. And you can't fault the B'Tselem organisation, which is an Israeli human rights organisation. That's why they're getting all the flack the moment they speak in the United Nations. They round on anybody who tells the truth about it, and that includes every human rights and every judge that ever goes there, including poor old what's-his-face that did that big report. Goldstein. Everybody who's critical of Israel immediately gets dismissed as not having credibility. Well, you've got to start to wonder who loses credibility.
I think one question that we need to be answered is, to what extent has Israel expended money and effort to fight BDS? It's as if it's a war against BDS.
Yeah.
That's why the successes of BDS, no matter how limited, should be applauded and supported. If you could explain to us, if anybody knows information about the extent of the Israeli efforts to fight BDS?
Look, thank you for that, Ahmed. It's a very important point. Israel has now identified the BDS as, after Iran, the most serious strategic threat, which is just telling you how insane they are. This is, after all, a peaceful, non-violent form of protest, conscience protest. But that tells you how successful it's been. Your point is a very important one. They've appointed a special minister and a whole ministry. They've invested enormous amounts of money to fighting it around the world. This is telling you something important for us, that it's working, it's important, and it deserves to be supported precisely because they're so crazy about it. And so that's a very important insight.
Yeah, I mean, look, students in Israeli universities are given scholarships to dramatize the virtues of the State of Israel and to attack the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Yeah. I mean, the hate mail I get every week it's highly organized. It's a result of a huge investment. I think there's a more subtle and hidden issue that Ahmed refers to, and that's the extent to which the mainstream media here are compliant in the false claims made about Israel, or rather the total reluctance to have open commentary. I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book wrote this so-called novel, but it's an account of what actually happened in 2002 and 2003, is to ask people to start to speak without fear about the Palestinian tragedy. There are about 100 major films have been made about the Holocaust. There isn't one major feature film, several documentaries, ever made about the Nakba, about the Palestinian tragedy. I think so that whether the answer about the money is a crucial one. If you remember Deep Throat and All the President's Men, the only three things he said to Woodward and Bernstein was, follow the money.
I'd like to ask you a question, Peter, because as you know, I don't agree with this all-out liberalism that you're propounding, and I suspect that there are people in the room who are mainly on your side, but not mine. I mean, the idea that we should side as the left with Brandis and agree with him that everybody has the right to be a bigot might be fine in the abstract, but I think you have to contend with the fact that what it amounts to concretely in Australian politics at the moment is delivering a big free kick to the right, to people who want to, wind back Indigenous rights, who want to ban BDS. So, in my view, it takes us absolutely in the opposite direction from the kind of society that, we want to see everyone living in. And the idea that it's appeal to abstract principles of that kind, which is what is protecting the left, just seems to be absolutely not the case. What's protecting the left is the interests of the actors and their determination to pursue them. The idea that, there's a protection for us which comes from some abstract principle of free speech, I think is mistaken and ignores the concrete political realities. So I just wonder if you could reply to that. Thanks.
Yeah, look, thank you, Nick. I appreciate your asking the question because I had you in mind when I said what I did. Look, I do appreciate it because I wanted to provoke exactly this kind of conversation. Mind you, I think we can test it, but I think you're wrong about how many people are on your side or my side. Part of the reason I said it was that I suspect most people actually share your view, and I had hoped in some ways that what I was saying would be controversial for most people. But okay, so the issues are very interesting and very important. The first thing I want to say is perhaps to reflect on whether it does help the left. And let me give my own personal example, if I may. I mean, the issue is to hold the other side to the principles that they believe in. Now, perhaps forgive me for giving my own personal example, but I'm rather proud of the fact of enjoying a certain notoriety for having been banned from Jewish conferences, where I've tried to say things that they don't want to hear. And not only that, but actually it's not even that I'm saying things they don't want to hear, but because I support BDS, actually. Now, my line, in order to demand a hearing, so to speak, was to say, look, you either believe in the kind of principles that you espouse, the liberal principles, as they say actually in their documents, this is a forum for all views, and you point to their own hypocrisy and inconsistency when there are views, after all, that cross some red lines, as they call it, and so on. So I relied on being able to say that you either believe in these liberal principles or you don't. And I'm then charging with the Goebbels style totalitarian views, closet totalitarians. I think that's very powerful, and I do think that that helps us, because after all, we're the views that they can dominate because they have the power. And it has a kind of traction among people. People hear that. A lot of the letters to the editor when I did this would say, look, we don't agree with Slezak about anything, but we should have the right to hear him. One of the leaders in this community, for example, Robert Goot, I can mention by name, he's the president of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry. It shows how absurd they are. He says, Jews should not be forced to listen to Slezak. What, as if it was going to be compulsory to come to hear my talks? I mean, they make themselves appear stupid. Well, I don't have to explain. Maybe nobody would have come to my talk, but they didn't want me on the program because they fear that somebody might hear what I have to say, not just me, but all of us, and they might find it persuasive and discover that we're not the devil incarnate. So that's the power, that we can hold them to their own principles. So, just to repeat the point I was trying to make, was that we're the weaker side here. They have the money and the resources and so on, and I don't know how, we can use this judo thing to throw them by their own strength, except by arguing that they should uphold the principles that they believe in. So it's a long conversation.
I'm grateful in particular to Peter for raising the question of academic freedom and the challenges that it's under at the moment. There's a quote, I can't remember it precisely, but by Harold Lasky, I think in the 1940s, where he talks about when the dean comes into a room full of faculty, full of academics, that all he needs to do is more or less indicate the way his mind is operating for everyone present to suddenly decide that that was the way their intellectual compass was going to take them and precisely the way they were going to go off and research. But it seems to me that there are far less subtle ways that universities have for the last 20, 30 years been attacking the whole question of how it can best control thought and best stop what used to be a very open academy in the 50s and 60s, perhaps even the 70s. For example, the University of Melbourne, at least until recently, published a manual for applicants to Australia Research Council grants, telling them how not to antagonise, in specific form, how not to antagonise Andrew Bolt. It was published over the name of the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, and it should be publicly available. I think also there's the question of selection procedures, how utterly undemocratic they are, the secrecy behind them, how the most outrageous slurs can be made about candidates and tend to be made about left-wing candidates for positions, and can't be in any way challenged until a year or two later you do a freedom of information claim. So my point is, isn't there also an increasing wave of very direct attacks, very direct ways of controlling academics, not just the subtle ways?
I want to take us back to the issue of the relative freedom of Israeli academics versus Palestinian academics, because the emphasis upon the freedom of speech and academic freedom, and which is an argument why we should not. Why we should refuse to cooperate with certain Israeli universities over various activities. I'm in favour. I think that's a form of freedom, to refuse to cooperate with people whose immediate neighbours have no freedom whatsoever. I don't see how you can argue about, academic freedom for the privileged if it is the means of stifling people who have no freedom whatsoever. So I think, in other words, I'm concerned about what's happened on the universities, because it seems to be some form of sort of bureaucratic constipation because of the intellectual mediocrity of people in management that has stifled a great deal of freedom, and the absence of protest by those of us who used to serve on the university senates and kick up a fuss.
I'll just say a few words in response to what you've said. You're absolutely right in your analysis of what's going on, and I can just illustrate it a little bit. One of the things that's happened at the university is that, partly as a result of the loss of tenure, is that the managerialism that has taken over has become, I mean, I've been there long enough now that I remember how things were not that long ago, but the new staff don't know that it was ever different. So, for example, in my university, but perhaps elsewhere, we used to have staff meetings where we would vote, we would argue about things, we would dispute what kind of job we would advertise, we would look at the applicants. None of that happens anymore. We've actually abolished faculty meetings and staff meetings where decisions were made in some kind of collegial democratic way. It's all by edict from above. Now, the younger staff members don't know that it was ever different. So they've internalised these managerial values. As you've indicated, they're fearful of objecting or protesting, and there's never even a forum. We're just isolated from one another, so there's no collective opportunity to say anything. So the whole place has completely changed. And my colleagues, the younger ones, are actually very conscious of the consequences of dissenting. One of the colleagues in my age group was actually performance managed out. He was the most outspoken critic of what was going on, very well informed, serious academic, and they found ways to essentially dismiss him. Now that's the lesson, and it's not lost on other academics where they have to be careful. And of course, for the most part, the worst of it is that it's not even the conscious conformity, it's internalising these values and then espousing it. They get into management positions and then they apply these managerial rules willingly and think that they're doing the right thing. So it's very serious.
The real issue here is what Stuart mentioned, you mentioned also, Peter Slazak, and that is the freedom to think and the freedom to speak. When I went to university, that was never an issue. I'm discussing it right here in Australia, and it almost makes me feel like going back to Canada, but I won't do that yet. I think that's terrific what you guys have spoken about. Let's not forget it. It's the freedom to think, it's the freedom to speak. Forget about Israel for the moment. That's the real issue here.
Look, it's about the fact that universities look and function much more like business corporations than educational institutions. So the absurd respect for the bottom line is so, I mean, it's so easy that even one premier like the former John Fay understood it and could recite it. I mean, that's the issue. So you've got, I mean, when I first came to Sydney, nobody was paying exorbitant fees. The students were, even the notion of being full-time student is a fraud. Is fraudulent. Except the students with wealthy, generous, patronising parents. The idea of the place as being somewhere where you might read a book, let alone twice, that seems to have disappeared entirely. So it's partly because, well, it's disproportionately about the political economy. I mean, the fact that Sydney University is being run by a rump of corporate people with almost no elected students or staff representatives anymore, or alumni, is an example.
Can I add something? One of the things I wanted to add was I happened to speak yesterday at a forum organised by the university for early career researchers, and the topic of the forum was whether academics should be activists. I mean, but one of the points I made, which I think is relevant to your remark, is that an example which is a version of boycott. There was a move or a proposal that our university divest from fossil fuels. And the response of the Vice-Chancellor, which is online, it's a public document, was that, well, we can't divest from this sort of thing because that would be political, as opposed to being neutral. Now, this is such transparent nonsense, as if investing is not political. The idea that you can be neutral, I don't have to explain it, your reactions indicate that this is a ridiculous position, but that's relevant, that when, well, I don't have to explain it, but that's the climate in which they can use these sophistries to pretend that they don't have to take what are important moral actions about the environment or about boycotts and other things which are, of course, political, as if not acting is not political.
Yeah, I've been labelled an anti-Semite myself, but I just like to say I believe there's good and bad in every race, colour, species and profession. And cheers to all the good, moral and ethical Jews out there. My first question is about the 18C. Do you believe the 18C aids the bogus war on Islam as the main target? And if 18C was introduced, would it create a big problem for this, do you believe? My second question is about Israel's invasion of the Golan Heights after the ISIS Arab Spring, because they heard there was oil there. The company involved, Genie Oil, has Rupert Murdoch and Dick Cheney, amongst others, as major shareholders. I'd just like to ask you, do you think their invasion of the Golan Heights for this oil is in any way illegal? And if by any chance Assad and Russia win the war in Syria, well, what do you think will happen to their chances of keeping the oil?
Oh, I think you need a professor of philosophy to answer that question.
Where do I start? Look, let me just say something more or less at random among the things that you raised. Too many difficult questions. In terms of invading areas like Golan Heights, I mean, they're all illegal. Israel's entire occupation and everything it's done has been illegal. The worst point, and the serious point, is it gets away with it. It has impunity because America allows it. The rest of the world allows it. That's where we're at with BDS, to get back to that point. We and the Palestinians and the rest of the world have no other recourse than to act in these collective ways, because governments are not living up to their responsibilities under international law and human rights law. And so all those invasions are illegal. I don't know what to say about Syria.
Peter, could you clarify firstly what you mean by true tenure, so that academics and non-academics can appreciate both its meaning but also its insinuation? And secondly, technically speaking, Arabs are actually Semitic in origin. So when Jews actually attack Arabs, technically speaking, aren't they the ultimate anti-Semites?
Well, look, we don't have to worry about the definition of anti-Semitic. In this context, it's important not to worry about the precise definition. It means Jew hatred. And so, although Arabs are Semites, that's a kind of semantic and technical issue. But on your other question, it's a very good question to be a bit more precise about what tenure means. In America, where tenure is upheld as sacrosanct, there's always a let-out clause. And the let-out clause, I mean, apart from the let-out clause, it means permanent employment and no possibility of dismissal for anything except gross misconduct. Gross misconduct is defined quite carefully. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's some horrendous, illegal acts. There has to be some limit, but that leaves enormous scope for saying terrible things. I mean, for example, denying the Holocaust. I mean, in France there was a notorious case where, and it's illegal in some countries. Here too, in various places it's problematic. So it leaves room for enormous freedom to saying a lot of rubbish and saying things that are false, and that's the principle. And by the way, when I first looked at this when we lost it, I read a book by two professors of history who wrote a book on tenure, Hofstadter and Metzger, two historians actually that were at my university, Columbia University. And the first page explains tenure in the following way. They give the analogy of judges. No matter how political the appointment of judges may be, as it often is, once they're appointed, they have tenure because their judgments then are free from the threat of consequences when they make their decisions. Their decisions then can be made, for better or for worse, as they see fit. Now that's the analogy these guys gave for what academic tenure. So you can say, look, when I was appointed, I had this enormous sense of freedom to disagree with all of my colleagues, as I did in my disciplinary area, knowing that they couldn't do anything about it. They had to put up with me. And I loved it. And that's no longer the case. So that's the point of tenure.
When, throughout the centuries, could you ever account that freedom of speech in its true meaning ever existed? Ever?
I think the freedom holds until further notice. It's a bit like justice. You have to struggle with it every day to define it and to redefine it. So it's not some sort of tangible outcome that you can that's so visible that you could measure it. I mean, it's in the process. You know it most when you've been denied it. So for me, it's like the bread of justice. Everybody should have it, and everybody should have a go at it several times a day. And whether it's in I mean, in every context, whether it's the family or in the workplace or in the conduct of peace negotiations with African psychopaths, or I'm thinking of something particularly personal, it's so precious that you struggle with it every day.
I'll just add to that. Look, you may be right, but the point of it is that there wouldn't have been a reason for John Stuart Mill to have written his famous paper. There wouldn't have been a reason for us to keep reinforcing the point, except that these are ideals that we have to strive for, and we have to argue for them precisely because they're so easily lost. So while your point is an important one, that just reinforces the need for us to uphold these principles, to keep repeating them, because they're important if we, as we do, think that they are the foundations of a decent society. So you're quite right, but that is only the reason why we have to keep arguing for them.
I've got a pretty loud voice, so maybe I don't need a microphone. The question of academic tenure is just a step on the way. You look at Julian Trigg, you look at the Solicitor General. There is nothing in this country which this government will not demolish if it's called freedom.
Not a question. Look, John, I agree with you. I mean, you're really inferring something about the desperate need for a Bill of Rights in this country, and the best argument for the Bill of Rights is the argument that is mounted against it, that it would allow Parliament to do what it likes. And so that's the best argument for introducing it. Before we end, I really want to take us back to BDS, if I may, very briefly. I mean, the reason that establishment figures, despite the alleged success, don't want to touch it concerns the right of return, the right of the refugees to return. That's the one that it's Resolution 194, and that raises the serious question about what sort of Israeli state is being referred to. The controversy about the Palestinians, the millions still stranded in refugee camps' right to return, raises this question about the nature of the Jewish state. Is it a state in which all the citizens have equal rights? Is it a democratic state with equal rights, or is it a Jewish supremacist state where the idea of democracy is completely subordinated to so that groups other than Jewish citizens, like Arabs and Christians, have virtually no rights at all? And that it's that juxtaposition of those two views of the Israeli state that is why all the mainstream media here won't touch this issue.
Yeah. Let me just add to that. Stuart's right to bring it back to Israel and Palestine. And on that specific issue, it's very important to know that while on the one hand the Palestinians have enshrined in international law their legal rights to return to their home or to be compensated, you must know, and you may know, that Jews hold for themselves what they call the law of return, which is this spurious rule that Jews that have nothing to do, like me or other Jews in Europe or in America from Brooklyn, they have some right that Israel recognises simply by virtue of being Jews to go and take the land and have more rights than a Palestinian whose house they may well move into, who still holds the key. Now that proves something very important about the conception of Israel as a Jewish state, and you should know that when they are arguing with the Palestinians about what the Palestinians are expected to do, it's not enough to recognise Israel as a state. They are demanding something which the Palestinians cannot acknowledge, that it should not only be a state, but it should be a Jewish state, which disenfranchises 20% of the current Arab population. And the other thing that is very important to understand is that Israel currently makes a distinction that no other country makes. It's between citizenship and nationality. While the Palestinians who live in Israel have Israeli citizenship, their passport and their documents show that they don't have Israeli Jewish nationality. And that precludes them from all sorts of rights, like owning a lot of the property and so on. So this is a very, as Stuart brightly put it, a racist and a supremacist state, And the public ought to be aware of this, and the more that's made public, the harder it is for them to defend the whole idea of the project.
Okay, well, I'm going to wind up now, and I know Wynn's going to speak, but I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight, and could you please put your hands together once more for our two fabulous speakers.